All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for attending today. The Is Hate Speech a Constitutional Right? A panel in Town Hall. I'm Emily Davies. I'm the Senior Investigative Reporter at WSAW News Channel 7, and I've been here for about a decade, and I've covered a lot of different things, including hate speech, hate crimes, right here in our community in the far past, as well as the recent history as well, and that is what we're going to be talking about today. The free speech, hate speech, and the limits of the Constitution to public speech. We won't leave you with doom and gloom, though. We will have some strategies because while people may have rights to deliver hate speech, you also have rights for speech as well. So we'll talk about what you can do if you are not happy about what you hear. And we want to thank the Wisconsin Institute for WIPS for hosting us today, and we have a knowledgeable panel of your fellow community members and leaders in our state. So let me introduce them. We have Mayor Katie Rosenberg from Wausau. We have Trent Spoolstra, who is the Anti-Defamation League Associate Regional Director. State Attorney General Josh Kaul. We have Patrol Captain Todd Baeten with the Wausau Police Department. And then we have Mount Sinai Congregation Vice President Andrew Lynch. And then Allison Hayden is the Jewish Community Relations Council Project Manager. So each panelist will have an opportunity to speak on their expertise about this topic. And of course, if you know anything about me, I will be asking some follow-up questions as well. We will also leave about a half hour of time at the end of this for your questions. Again, thank you for showing up or listening in online. This will be streamed and shared or saved online that you can watch it later. But we do ask your questions, be respectful. We are open to critiques, debate, things like that. But we want to make sure that this is a respectful space, not for hate. As an investigative journalist, I ask really tough questions, so I know that they can be asked in respectful ways, so we just ask that as well. So with that, we'll start things off with Mayor Katie Rosenberger.
And thank you very much for being part of this panel and asking good questions. I guess I'm kind of the convener of this group. Trent and I have been talking for I don't even know how long about some of the goings on here in Wausau, some things that I was looking for tips on. But I'm kind of couching what I'm saying right now, probably being less direct, because I want to make sure that we're talking about lots of our community members. I think one of my goals as mayor and just as a citizen of this community is to make sure that everybody feels welcome here. And that comes from whatever your background is, however you identify. And we've gone through some really tough conversations here in our community over the last, maybe 3 years, but also maybe the last 10 years, maybe the last 20 years. Maybe it's always been tough, but it feels really tough today, especially when we feel like we can't approach a topic and be very direct and say, I need you to stop saying these things because it's harming us. I guess I can say that, and I have. We've had multiple conversations regarding Community for All, right? We've had Pride Month discussions. We've had Stop Asian Hate, and now we're discussing how anti-Semitism is kind of wrecking some of our community events because we have to listen to it. And it's really tough because there is a constitutionally protected right to speech. And we don't want to infringe on that, but we also want to make sure that the rest of our community feels like they belong here. And I know that it's really harmful to individuals who are hearing it. I know that it's really harmful for folks who want to say that's not who we are as a community. But we are all kinds of different people here. So my goal for all of this is that we have a robust and good discussion, and also come away with some tips on how to deal with it. My tip for myself and that I've been sharing with others is ignore it. But it's really hard, and it's really hard when you feel like you're specifically targeted. And for me, it's also personal. I have a lot of people who assume that I'm Jewish, and they try to insult me in that way. And so I understand exactly where people are coming from, because it's personal, and they're trying to get your goat. So I'm hoping that we have a really good discussion here, and I'm excited for the tough questions you plan to ask.
There we go. Hello, everybody. So thank you very much for coming out. And thank you for all these amazing panelists. So another topic today for today's discussion is looking at hate speech, constitutional right, things like that. I wanted, from ADL's perspective, I wanted to give a little, kind of set the stage, a little background about what's been happening in our country the last several years, right? Why are we here today talking about this? Why is this becoming a bigger and bigger issue, not just here in Wausau, not just in Wisconsin, but really nationwide? So at ADL, or Anti-Defamation League, we are a Jewish-founded organization. So anti-Semitism is a big part of what we fight and combat. But in reality, we are an anti-hate organization. And so we track all various types of hate crimes and hate incidences. And one of the things that ADL has been researching, and probably is not news to anybody, but over the last, I would say, roughly 6, 7, 8 years, we've seen a dramatic increase in hate crimes and hate instances in the United States. And I could go down the list. The things that you see on the news, on the 6 o'clock news, the local news, national news, those things are at just the tip of the iceberg. And I'm talking about things such as the shooting that took place in South Carolina with Dylan Roof when he went to an African-American church. I'm talking about the Tree of Life incident in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 2018 when a shooter went in on a Saturday morning and killed numerous individuals. There was the incident about a year and a half ago in Colleyville, Texas, where an individual went during a Shabbat service and essentially took hostage individuals for roughly about 12 hours. Thankfully, nobody was harmed in that one. That was, in an odd way, of a success story of that could have gone a whole lot different, in a lot of different ways. But those things that you see on the news are the things that we hear about. What we don't hear about at ADL, what we track, I know JCRC does as well too, which is the instances that we hear about in the workplace, the things that we hear about in schools, universities, other institutions that we all go to, and they're not necessarily hate instances. The hate are the most extreme cases that we see, and we track at ADL. But at ADL, one of the things that we believe is that hate is not something that just happens overnight. People don't wake up tolerant one day or go to bed tolerant one day and become hateful the next. That hate is like a virus, and hate develops and grows. And if left unchecked, it could reach extreme forms. So one of the things that ADL does is we concentrate on looking at biases, looking at stereotypes, what people are thinking, comments that people make. And then when people start acting on their hate or start acting on their anti-Semitism, they start doing things like vandalizing buildings, like synagogues or churches, attacking individuals in the workplace or at school or harassing them because they are different than they are. And so one of the things that we have noticed in the United States, and happy to get into it later, of why this is happening, why this has happened over the last 6, 7 years, which is that ADL, it's not just anecdotal evidence. The ADL has proof that specifically anti-Semitism, hate in general is definitely going up, but specifically with the anti-Semitism, we publish reports every year specifically looking at anti-Semitic acts. And earlier this January, we actually published a report that we look at every 4 to 5 years, looking at anti-Semitic attitudes specifically. And in January, our report came out, and we found, based on respondents, about 4,000 individuals nationwide, that roughly 20% of Americans, about one out of 5, harbor anti-Semitic thoughts or harbor anti-Semitic prejudice. Now, to be fair, I'm not saying 20% of Americans are ready to attack synagogues or attack Jews. I'm not saying that. But at the base of hate is stereotyping. It's what people are thinking. And right now we see 20% of Americans who believe in the age-old, millennium-old Jewish stereotypes, and go through the entire list, that have been debunked time and time again, and yet people are still believing them. In fact, anti-Semitic sentiment in the United States is at its highest rate than it was since 1992 in 30 years. We saw a trend that was going down, and over the last 6, 7 years, that trend's going up. It's not just people who are thinking things that are anti-Semitic or holding stereotypes. It's people acting on anti-Semitism. Every spring, ADL publishes a report as our anti-Semitic audit of anti-Semitic incidences, where we track specifically harassment, vandalism, and assault in the United States. And so we look at the previous calendar year. For calendar year 2022, ADL confirmed 3,700 acts of harassment, vandalism, and assault. So to put that another way, to kind of visualize it, that's roughly 10 anti-Semitic acts happening in the United States at any given point and at any day. What's shocking is we've done this report every year since 1979. Over the last 5 years, we've hit all-time high numbers. So if I were giving this presentation in 2019, I would have told you we had the highest number since 1979. 2021, I would have come back and said, nope, just top 2019's number. Now we've hit the all-time high number. And now this is the third time in the last 5 years that we've hit all-time high numbers of anti-Semitic acts. And these, ladies and gentlemen, are the ones that we know about. Like other types of crimes and hate instances go largely unreported. So odds are the numbers are actually a lot higher than what is being confirmed and reported to us. That's the environment that our country has been living in for the last 6 or 7 years, and a number of marginalized groups across the United States have been experiencing over the last 6 to 7 years.
And with that, you're tracking hate crimes at that point, harassment, actual violence. So it's not just comments.
It is. So what's interesting enough, so we do track, so like vandalism, assault when it hits crimes. When it comes to harassment too, that's why we call it incidences and not just crimes, because we're looking at, we can confirm somebody, for instance, in a school, a Heil Hitler salute that's thrown up by some kid. Or, for instance, taunting or constant ridiculing of somebody of a different color or various sexual orientation, that gets covered as well too. So that's where it's a little bit different when you look at, say, the FBI hate crimes data, and you look at our numbers and you're like, well, why are the numbers different? Well, we track different things, we look at different things, but regardless of what report you're looking at, whether from JCRC, from ADL, from a federation, from the FBI, all the numbers are going up.
And with that too, I know the UN had been talking and linking a lot of hate speech, how that kind of incites individuals, not even just groups, but individuals,
Yep.
and then also incites genocide ultimately. We've seen it in Rwanda, we've seen it obviously with World War II.
Yep.
Is that something that we're seeing in your data that you're finding?
Yeah, we are. Actually, I'll share a quick story. So in Waukegan, so on the north side, suburban north side of Chicago, last fall when the Kanye, Ye, Kyrie Irving instances were taking place on Twitter, Americans will say, well, what's the big deal about a celebrity saying something hateful? It doesn't impact my community. Literally, I think it was 3 days after that comment was made, there is a very prominent Jewish cemetery in Waukegan. And I remember a call, it was my colleagues who are here today, we were in the office, we got a call from a local news agency saying, do you know about the graffiti that got hit at the Jewish cemetery? We're like, what are you talking about? There was a drone, or they were filming some story, I forgot exactly what exactly happened, but they went over the cemetery and they realized most of the cemetery markers got covered in swastikas. And one of them actually ended up saying Kanye, or Ye, was right. So these are examples of things when we say public officials, or when we say celebrities, or people in the media, when they have literally millions and millions of people following them. Yes, we believe in free speech. ADL, we will always stand by free speech, but at the same time, there's a responsibility that comes with free speech, especially if you're in the public and saying things that you know that people who are following you, that look up to you, they're going to act on those things. And that was a perfect example of something that happened last fall.
And Attorney General Josh Kaul can maybe speak to a little bit more of the legals.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, thank you to everybody who is part of this panel. Thank you for hosting. Thank you for convening, Mayor Rosenberg. And thank you to everybody who's joining us here today. I think this is an incredibly important topic, and as I'm going to talk about in a minute, one of the ways I think we can most effectively address these issues is by having dialogue, having discussion, and sharing our values on critical issues. And your comments segue, I think, really well to some of the points I wanted to talk about. Starting with what I think about as Attorney General and what our Wisconsin Department of Justice thinks about with respect to some of these issues. I think it's important to take stock of where we are, because there has been a trend in the wrong direction on hate speech issues for several years now. Right now, domestic violent extremism is the top priority for our federal law enforcement officials because of the danger it poses to the safety of folks across the country. We work at the Department of Justice with federal law enforcement agency partners to ensure that our laws are being enforced. But the environment that we are in right now has led to a real danger to the safety of people because of this violent extremism. So what has caused this to change over the last several years. I think there are a few things that are at the root of what we are seeing. One is that, to the point you just made, people who have significant influence, they set an example that others follow. So whether it is an elected official or somebody with millions of followers because they're a celebrity, folks see that and they respond to it. And the more that we have elected officials and celebrities and others with large followings who are themselves engaging in hate speech, the more likely it is that people take that cue and view it as socially permissible themselves. We also have connectedness in a way that we never did before because of social media. There are a lot of positives that come with that, but if you are the only individual in your community who is willing to speak up in a biased way or with hate speech, you're no longer isolated the way you may have been a few decades ago. Now you can connect with other people over the internet, and that can lead to people becoming further radicalized. It can lead to them sharing dangerous, concerning, bigoted ideas. And because of that, I think we are also seeing a rise in hate speech. And the internet and social media is becoming a vector that connects folks. So legally speaking, when our Constitution was drafted, the framers of our Constitution drew a judgment on behalf of freedom in a number of different respects, including the freedom of speech. And the basic idea, the First Amendment that we are all familiar with, of course, is that we are free to say things. We have the freedom to say things that offend the government. We are free to say things that offend other people. And what the First Amendment does is it says that the government cannot take action against you based on the content of your speech. So whether that is political advocacy or speech about significant issues of the day, whether it's speech about your favorite sports team, or it's speech that I would find, and I think everybody here would find repugnant, that speech is protected, and our law enforcement officers are not permitted to take action because of the nature of the speech. That is a fundamental constitutional protection that has helped make our country and our democracy so successful. But there are trade-offs involved in any of these types of decisions made where we draw these lines about where speech is permissible and where it's not. Generally speaking, the rule we've drawn as a country, and our case law is consistent with this, is that once speech begins harming other people, that's where we begin to allow others to step in. Not harming people because they disagree with it, or even they're upset by it, but that it can cause an immediate danger to the physical safety of others. So the classic example is, yes, you have a right to speak, but you can't shout fire in a crowded theater because that may cause danger to people's safety. The challenge we face now is there is speech that may not itself directly lead to harm to people's well-being. It may not be incitement so that we can criminalize it, but it might foster an environment that leads to harm to others. There's been a phrase used recently in some of the dialogue on these issues called stochastic terrorism. And the idea is that if you keep fostering animosity or even hatred towards a particular group, it might spark acts of violence. If millions of people hear that people who belong to a particular group are causing harm or danger, somebody may act on that, not directly because the speaker is telling them to act, but because of their having seen that speech. And so when we see people being targeted, whether it's because of their religion, their immigration status, because they are a member of the LGBTQ community, or their race or ethnicity, or even in some cases their occupation, that can present a real danger. But that's the legal framework within which we work. That does not mean that we're without recourse, though. That's the thing to say. The First Amendment gives you a right not to have the government take action against you because of your speech. It does not give you a right to have people agree with you or to have people listen to you. And the best way that we can respond to speech that we disagree with is with more speech. As people target folks because of who they are or for other concerning reasons, we can respond by coming together and showing that hatred and bigotry are not values that our community embraces. In fact, they are values we reject. That when people speak up to target folks who are members of particular groups, we are going to come together in greater force and talk about the importance of unity, talk about the importance of diversity and inclusion. When people target members of any particular group, including especially vulnerable groups or small minority groups, we will stand together and advocate for them because it is vital that we respond to that kind of hateful speech. Now, at the Department of Justice, we do a few things. One is we have the Wisconsin Statewide Intelligence Center, which we operate. It's a fusion center where state Division of Criminal Investigation investigators work with folks from other law enforcement agencies, in particular federal agencies, but also state partners. If there are dangers to the safety of Wisconsinites, what we do is we work to get information to local law enforcement so that there can be a response that happens. I would also like to see Wisconsin adopt a hate crime hotline so that anytime there is a potential hate crime, there can be a single point to report that to. We've advocated for legislation and would like to see something passed into law. I'm also an advocate for civil rights enforcement authority at our Wisconsin Department of Justice so that if our civil rights laws are violated, our State Department of Justice can take action. And then we do have hate crime enhancements in Wisconsin. The state Supreme Court has held that you cannot have a standalone crime that is called a hate crime. But what you can do is if somebody commits a crime that is motivated by bias, there can be an enhancement in the sentence that they face. And what I encourage people to do when they see potential hate crimes is to contact your elected officials, to contact law enforcement. Again, a single hate crime hotline would be ideal. But reaching out to law enforcement so that you can work with them and identify the challenges that have arisen and how an appropriate response can be developed is critical. In a lot of cases, they won't have the ability to bring an enforcement action because speech is protected. But that doesn't mean that you can't work with partners, you can't work with law enforcement agencies to be clear about what your values are and what the community's values are. The more that we respond by coming together and making clear that we don't approve of certain types of speech that is targeted at particular groups, the more that I think that discourages that kind of speech.
I have two things for you. If you could explain, I know that like the FBI data, obviously you're not the keeper of that, but our state helps contribute to that. I believe when I looked last, about 3/4 of our law enforcement agencies put data in there, but we know that it's not complete. Can you explain a little bit about what that data looks like and why it's not complete?
Yeah, so every state around the country is required to keep certain data to comply with federal requirements, and that data is then kept on a national level as well as a state level. Because of the different treatment of hate crimes in different states, some places it may be a standalone crime, other places it may be an enhancement. And then because of differences in how enforcement happens from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, we don't have very good data just in general about where hate crimes are happening and to what extent. We want to improve that, and there are efforts to improve the collection of that data. But one of the challenges we face is that there's not a uniform way to report potential hate crimes. That's one of the reasons a hate crime hotline would be helpful. And then secondly, we don't expect members of the public to be experts on drawing these fine constitutional distinctions between what kind of speech rises to the level of potentially being part of a crime and what is constitutionally protected. And so I think what happens is a lot of people don't report when they see concerning incidents. Or if they do, sometimes they're told, we appreciate your reporting, but there's nothing we can do. So I do think having more systems in place to focus on this issue, knowing that it's a problem, is going to help us collect better data. But we do rely on private groups like the ADL and others to identify hate speech and help identify trends that are happening.
And when it comes to finding that line for legal, can you explain that a little bit? Because, and even protecting safety and health, We know that racism can cause heightened awareness on a regular basis, which can deteriorate people's health. But maybe something that's said doesn't rise to the level of a legal authority. So where is that line when it crosses to where there is action, especially when it's maybe just on that fringe and there hasn't been a physical act committed? Where is that line to protect safety, especially with, say, harassment?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not a simple answer to that question, and it varies by context. So in the workplace context or the school context, there can be speech that rises to a level that it becomes harassment. And then you can see potentially civil enforcement actions brought. That is the kind of repeated, intimidating speech that causes somebody significant distress. The particulars, though, are going to vary from case by case. Criminally speaking, we generally don't make speech a crime. People can say almost anything with certain limitations. Again, incitement, for example, could be a crime, but that's used in extremely rare cases. Where speech becomes problematic is in certain specific contexts. So if a threat is made, that then becomes considered more like an act. It is endangering somebody's safety. The U.S. Supreme Court actually recently issued a new decision regarding threats laws. I would like to see Wisconsin law updated to have more clarity on what threats are a crime, and we're working on proposed legislation on that front as well. But it's going to depend on the context and the nature of it, and it's almost always very specific to the facts. And so, again, what I encourage people to do is a couple things. Number one, if you have a significant concern, reach out to your elected officials and to law enforcement. And number two, if you see speech that is concerning, bring people together and respond with speech that is conveying the message you want to convey. The more that people see an inclusive message, that their divisive, hateful rhetoric is leading to bringing people together, that's going to deter that speech. If they see people who become divided because of that, that's going to lead to a different reaction. And so we have a lot of power to respond with our own speech.
Captain Baeten, I know that you guys have had a lot of officers present during some of the local instances. Talk to me a little bit about what you guys have seen from a law enforcement side here locally.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for allowing me to be a panelist on this discussion. It's a very important and insidious topic, talking about hate speech in our community. We were talking a little bit before the panel discussion began, and affirm that at the police department we really don't staff attorneys or constitutional scholars, and so we rely on expertise of other individuals, and the counsel that we've received at the police department that we then convey to our line staff, those uniformed officers that are out in the field, really mirrors what we're hearing already. And so the bit of a dilemma that creates, at least on the part of our officers, is we hire women and men of action. We hire individuals that are interested in creating a better community. They want to respond to a call. They want to resolve a concern. So they get called on scene. They see people that are obviously rattled and upset, and rightfully so, and they're learning some basic details about a situation. But those same men and women have also sworn or affirmed an oath to uphold the Constitution. And so at times, the enforcement side of this can feel a little bit like a moving target of sorts as we try to look at each situation on its own specific nuanced facts. So as we've heard already, generally speaking, our officers can only, speech can only be actionable when there's these specific threats that are made towards individuals. Or this incitement to some type of imminent criminal activity. So it's one thing for an individual to be using speech that we would find abhorrent, but then, and that would be protected, but then for that individual to say, and therefore, let's go get that person, or to say, let's tear this building to the ground as a manifestation of that speech, that becomes very, very different. And those are things then that our officers would be able to take more overt enforcement action on. So what do we do in the meantime? we do what we're doing right now. We have these communications and these conversations. The time to formulate a response to this type of speech is not as it comes out of an individual's mouth. Our response to this speech has already happened a long time ago, in that we're building those relationships that have been mentioned. We're looking for opportunities to strengthen those relationships and build those conversations and discussions on common beliefs with other individuals and entities and organizations like-minded within our community, so we can continue to make Wausau a really good place to be. So our mission statement reads in part that we partner with our community to enhance the quality of life. So those partnerships lead to our fulfillment of that mission, and we definitely want to do that. The vast majority of what our officers do is not, driving around fast and kicking in doors and things like that. It's having conversations. It's having really important and sometimes very difficult conversations about things. And we recognize that there's some limitations to what our officers can do, and while that cannot sit very well with others at times, I can assure you it doesn't always sit really well with us either. So while I don't pretend to have all the answers to everything, what I can guarantee is that the police department stands ready to have those conversations, have those relationships, and to learn and grow with and from each other as we continue to tackle this difficult problem.
And speaking to a couple of different more specific incidences in Wausau, we've had the littering of some leaflets, kind of with a nameless person, attached to it, kind of sprinkled throughout Wausau. We've had people shouting in public spaces, and we've had maybe kids at school, saying things that are, considered hate speech, maybe by the person who's on the other end. So what can officers in those, I know it's specific to each instance, but what can officers respond with, and what should people expect?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And kind of like we already heard already, it's behaviors that we can address, not the content of the message. So we'll take the example of flyers or leaflets that contain hate materials written on them. In a case like that recently, a citation for littering was issued. But that wasn't based on the content of that message. It was based on the behavior. So we would, for example, let's say there was a gender reveal party or something and a lot of debris was left in a public area. We would issue a citation for that as well, for littering, or leaflets advertising an upcoming local garage sale or something along those lines. So we address behaviors as we can, and not the content of the speech, because of those limitations, and not limited, I'll say the rights, that are guaranteed by our Constitution.
I kind of asked a couple of questions in one. So going back to schools, for example, I know that parents are very protective of their kids if they feel like their kid, I don't know, maybe another student said something harmful, that maybe falls along the hate speech realm. Maybe it's something to do with somebody's race. In that realm, in that school realm, especially, we have school resource officers here in Wausau. What should parents and other kids, other students, the student body expect from a police side of things?
Yeah, you're correct. We have school resource officers in our schools here. We have a fantastic relationship with the Wausau School District, and I think it just filters right back to what we talked about in terms of those relationships and that open communication. We need to know about things that are happening in order for us to make an assessment of what our officers are going to be able to do in each of those situations. The moment we start to feel like, nothing got done with this last time, or the police have better things to do than worry about this, I'm just going to kind of let this go, we miss an opportunity. We miss an opportunity to strengthen that bond, and we miss an opportunity to provide that information that may be part of the fabric of a much larger narrative that allows us to maybe take that necessary step forward, inching us closer to those opportunities to take some more action that would give us more concrete remedies to these situations.
All right, we want to move on. Thanks, Todd.
All right, great, thank you. Thank you everyone for attending today, and for everyone out in the audience and here and online as well. So I'm the Vice President of the Board of the Mount Sinai Congregation, which is the home for central Wisconsin Jews for several decades, and we I don't know. There's nothing all that remarkable, really. We're just normal people that want to worship as we do, and to do so without problems, just like anyone else. So when we see these incidences of hate speech or like the leaflet littering, we kind of have to make a decision. Is this something we're going to make a big fuss about, or we want to ignore it? Is this person seeking attention, or is there something even do we feel that this is something they're going to take a step further? And our congregation is made up of families and individuals from all over central Wisconsin, from Stevens Point up to Minocqua and other points north, Marshfield, and so we have a wide range of people and wide range of I guess views and occupations and everything like that, but we really try to encompass an environment and create an environment that really brings our members together. And what we're really trying to do is just maintain what we do and ignore a lot of the hate speech out there, because it is really a lot of recycled stuff. It's nothing new. And one thing that has come up recently, we're talking about the rise in the past few years of the numbers of incidences, and really the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh was really kind of a turning point. And we've taken some measures to look at our congregation, our building, and whatnot, and also to strengthen our bonds with our local police department, ADL, and Milwaukee Jewish Federation, and so that's a kind of a positive that we want to be able to draw out of it, as we've kind of made ourselves a little stronger, despite someone trying to bring us down. So I will say that from a legal standpoint, there is a threshold as far as when something is hate speech or not. But really, I think, and I'll speak for the anti-Semitism, but I'm fairly confident it probably applies elsewhere, that when you are that targeted group, that threshold is much lower. So it's disturbing, and it's not something we want to hear. I'm sure it's not something anybody wants to hear if they're downtown trying to enjoy a dinner or just walk around and they have to hear some yahoo out there shouting things. So but it kind of really hits our congregation members harder, and it's like, well, what can we do, and is there anything we can do? It's like not really, for all the reasons that we've kind of outlined here. But I do like Attorney General Kaul's idea of when there's speech you don't like, confront it with speech that you do like. And so I think everything that we've heard on this panel so far today has been excellent and wonderful, and I think it's something we can definitely as a community use to create a positive environment instead of a negative one that where someone wishes us ill or anything. So I don't know. I don't have too much more to say about it.
How has your congregation been when these instances come up? Is there fear? Is there increased security? How have you had to pivot when these things happen?
Some of the more national things, like I mentioned, the Tree of Life, that was kind of an opportunity for us to look at our facilities and how we do things. And I won't speak to any of those specifics, but more of the local things that have come up. Sometimes people hear about them through the news, and they may email and kind of say, hey, have you heard about this and what's going on? And I'll give them the best information that I have. But they're rightfully concerned, and they've seen these kinds of things happen years over and years over, and there's always a little bit more edge to it as far as, well, is this going to be the person that does something? So, we try to just kind of monitor the situation and see what, try to understand what this person's or any person's intentions are as best we can. And some things like, the synagogue had some pamphlets dropped at it. And we didn't report that to, the news or anything like that, because we knew that person that did it just wanted some attention. And we weren't going to do that, so.
I feel like maybe you're being a little humble too, because one of the things I noticed about Mount Sinai in the congregation is that folks want to welcome people in to understand more. I attended a slowed down version of a Friday service, and it was really neat because I could understand what was going on. I knew what you were talking about. I've been invited to Purim. I've been invited to a variety of things. So I think inviting people in and demystifying some of it, it's really been helpful, especially as educational purposes for people like me. So I think your community really does a whole lot.
We didn't slow it down too much for you.
And for someone, I think Allison will get to touch on this as well, but for someone who maybe isn't part of a particular community that's targeted of that hate speech, ignoring it sometimes feels like you're encouraging it or okay with it. Is there anything that you recommend when it comes to that, to be able to, if you're not part of that particular community that's the target of the hate speech, what to do?
That's a real good question. Like I said, with the pamphlets, we realized this person just wanted attention. We weren't going to give it to him. But, I think you really have to kind of try to understand what the, intentions were or are of what they're doing. And, at least to the best that you can. Some things just don't make sense. So I don't know that I really have a lot of good things to do, but it's a lot of it's going to be particular to the situation. I think kind of setting the expectations of as a community of what you think is appropriate in the public space. I think that's expected, and I think there's some things that are better than others, and that I think as a community we've agreed on a lot of those, and a lot of the things that we would classify as hate speech we don't want in our public space.
And I know Allison has a long list of things that you can do to equip, so go ahead, Allison.
Yeah, thank you. So we didn't compare notes beforehand, but so a lot of what I say will be repeats of what everybody else says, just kind of compiled into one. And so, as Trent said, we have seen this normalization of hate, rhetoric, anti-Semitic conspiracies, and the like. And it's no longer limited to the fringe, especially on social media. And it's very frequently promoted even in political discourse and flyers and public spaces. And through this repeat exposure, this hate speech and these hate incidents become normalized to the everyday person, and this hateful activity can accelerate, and as Trent and others have said, that can even motivate violent attacks, such as Colleyville and Tree of Life Synagogue. So what do we do? Well, it is important to understand and be aware of what the hate rhetoric out there is and what's being shared. Some of it will be very blatant, will be very obvious, but some of it will also take the form of dog whistles or symbols, things that people may repeat without fully understanding the anti-Semitic or hateful message behind it. But nevertheless, they are spreading these ideologies. So the ADL has an organization within it called the Center on Extremism, and I always say go there to their database for hate symbols if you don't understand something. They have a lot of resources, and it's a good first place. If some graffiti looks weird, if someone is saying a phrase over that you don't quite understand. And the Jewish Federation in Milwaukee does service the wider Wisconsin community, so we also have access into that. And so this seems like an obvious thing, is denounce the hate. You don't want to hear it, but oftentimes it's so easy to say, call out or respond to people who are farther away from you that are spouting it. But as Trent said, a lot of these incidents or start with conspiracies and bias that people are thinking, meaning that they're people that may be around you, friends and family, that are sharing things that they've read, sharing prejudice that they've heard. And it's often harder to talk to them about that, but those are the most important conversations to have. Treat it not as a punishment or an attack that they said something, but a moment of dialogue and a moment of learning together, because those are the people that you can really have change seen in, understanding that there will be people, extremists out there that you cannot have a conversation with, and there will be no productive change in their hateful ideologies. And though it often can be hard, the best way to handle hateful demonstrators is not to engage in them. I know you said ignoring them when you're not the targeted group feels very complicit. But by sharing the photos or videos of them or signs, flyers that they have online, what you're doing is giving their hateful message the attention that they want. Instead of sharing their content, it's better to acknowledge that you know that it existed, give a summary of what happened if you need to, but more importantly, focus on the community that was targeted and the impacted members of that community. So that means taking action in more positively focused ways, be that doing a counter demonstration or a unity event or a rally that is somewhere separate from where the hateful demonstrator is. You want to draw the media, you want to draw people away from that hate and instead emphasize the strength in your community and the diversity. If statements are made for social media, for the media, public announcements, they should focus instead on the unity on a community and with the goals of being inclusive and a safe community for all. They shouldn't be focused on the hate rhetoric because that's what they want, is to get that attention. And as we know through a lot of our work, through my work and many others here, when we build a stronger community and we spend time, as Mayor said, getting to know people that are different than you, you create those genuine connections and relationships. Those, in general, build safer democracies, safer communities for everyone. And it's been proven that bias are fought best with relationships. Obviously, we're all in this together. Even if you're not a targeted community, you're part of the wider community. So one thing I always like to quote is historian and current special envoy to combat anti-Semitism, Deborah Lipstadt, when she says, "The existence of prejudice in any of its forms is a threat to all those who value an inclusive, democratic, and multicultural society. Anti-Semitism flourishes in a society that is intolerant of others, be they immigrants or racial and religious minorities. When expressions of contempt for one group become normative, it is virtually inevitable that similar hatred will be directed at other groups." So what are some examples of things you can do? If you've experienced an incident or you've witnessed incidents, please report them. I know that we don't have a hate crimes reporting line yet. It would be great when we have that. But some places like the ADL, as well as the Jewish Community Relations Council, take those reports, and we work closely together as well as with security agencies. And one thing, as Trent was talking about, the ADL focuses on hate incidents like harassment and vandalism, where the Jewish Community Relations Council runs our own audit of anti-Semitic incidents every year, and our guidelines are a little differently. We actually focus on expressions of anti-Semitism. So those are things like people saying stuff in a classroom, saying things that are on that border of not hate speech, but are, again, targeting a community. And our goal is to kind of get a snapshot of what it's like to be Jewish in Wisconsin, as oftentimes people think anti-Semitism is dead or don't have an understanding of some of the language that is impacting our lives. So most of this data we compare year to year, such as ADL, and have shown that in Wisconsin, in the past 6 to 7 years, seen over a 400% increase in incidents. And this is for the wider Wisconsin area. And we use this data not just to guide educational and outreach resources, And one of the things as a community you can do is reach out to us or reach out to your local synagogue and use that opportunity to set up a time together, to socialize together. But a sad reality is we also use this data for security. As you talked a little bit about, this past weekend was Rosh Hashanah, the start of the Jewish New Year, and we were comparing what kind of security was outside of our synagogues, because that has become a normal endeavor for us that we live in. And one of the, this topic in general is important. And if you want to read up more on it, besides just the ADL and our own website, there are a few other organizations I recommend. There was recently a report put out specifically for confronting as a community hate rhetoric and hate demonstrations. And it was put out by the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Western States Center, and the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. I highly recommend it as a reading material because it does go through step-by-step of action items as a community you can do before. If you're aware of an incident or a demonstration of hate that's going to happen, it talks about how to inform your local law enforcement, how to plan counter programs, how to create messaging that focuses on the positive things away from the hateful messaging, as well as how to, in general, look at your community to build a stronger community. And so, obviously, this topic can be distressing. It can be depressing. It's something that I work with every day, so we've talked about earlier that we have a sense of normalcy in just what we accept as Jewish community members. So I do think it's important as people who are not used to it to remember it is a time to take care of yourselves as well. Focusing only on the negative aspects and the negative things you've experienced won't change the future. We must, focus on the joyful things, focus on the positive aspects. The fact that you all came out to this program in the, Monday morning is a positive turn of events here. And I think it's a really important way to empower yourselves and educate yourselves about what it means to build a safer community. So on that, I will turn it back over as we answer questions, but we're always happy to reach out and provide educational resources as needed.
So I've talked with a couple of people ahead of this panel who had concerns, and maybe Allison or anyone else who might feel like you have an answer to this, where, especially when it crosses with religion, a religious belief, and how that belief is translated, some people may find hateful, or some people may find that that's our belief, and they're not trying to incite violence. When is that, can you talk to me a little bit about that dynamic and how that can be handled with the true intent, I guess, behind the speech?
I mean, I will say that never assume negative intent from what people are saying, what people are sharing. So often things are said to me after I've done presentations that may sound hateful or may sound biased, but they're coming from places of ignorance or places of historical knowledge that they've always practiced. And so I use that as an opportunity to ask, well, why do you think that? Can we have a dialogue about this? Knowing that we may not ever agree, but if we can have a respectful conversation about why they think that and why I think that that's not okay, I think that is more important than focusing on what may or may not be hateful about it, because you never want to assume ill intent, because it puts your starting point at a negative to begin with.
And this kind of can be for whoever wants to answer. We have some public officials in our room, elected officials who run meetings and public meetings. Talk to me a little bit about the dynamic of what can be put in place. I know we've had some examples of hate speech in public comment, or maybe it's presentations, things like that, and what can be done in those settings, because those are very open settings where, as we've talked about, it's a constitutional right to be able to say what you want to say.
Yeah, it is a constitutional right to say what you want to say on your own time, wherever you are, right? And I think, I witnessed, or at least I saw a video clip of the incident you're mentioning, and I think part of this comes from being a chair of a committee or a board or a body, having training in what you can do to interfere with something that maybe is hateful, but it's also like against all decorum. And that's one of the things that we value as part of our public meetings is we all agree to Robert's rules or the council rules and all of this. And so if that were to happen at a meeting I was chairing, I would interrupt and I would say, you must stop. If it didn't, I do have the ability to turn off the microphones. So that's one of those moments where you don't use that all the time. But if there's a moment where it is absolutely unacceptable in that meeting, I would have no problem intervening in that point. But I'd also see that our state attorney general has something to say, and I hope that I'm not speaking out of turn.
No, I just wanted to follow up on the mayor's comments. This is another, and I'm going to preface this by saying I certainly understand why this basic concept can be frustrating, but it really does depend on context and what the situation is, which again makes it difficult as you're trying to think through, well, what are our options? But just, first, I think it's important to emphasize part of what makes our democracy so vibrant, part of what has made America so successful is that we are a pluralistic society. Our First Amendment rights are vital to our freedom, but also to the success of the country. And part of what that means is that we are going to hear things that we don't disagree with. There is not one right way to do things in the United States. There's not one right view on issues. And so part of being citizens in a democracy like the United States is encountering speech that you disagree with, and speech you may even find deeply, deeply offensive. I can assure you that, well, we've probably all seen people on, whether it's a cable news show or some other program, saying things that we just fundamentally disagree with. And part of our responsibility as citizens is to recognize that is part of our democratic process, and that strengthens us because we don't have a state-mandated or a government-mandated view on critical issues. So going into conversations with that background recognition, I think, is really important. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that somebody has the right to shut down a proceeding of the government so it can't do its work. So if folks are not following consistently applied rules that apply regardless of the content of what somebody is saying, that's a different story. In the school context, which you asked about before, while there are certain times when SROs may need to step in, schools have a lot of latitude, more than government officials would in other contexts, to ensure that there's a safe and healthy climate for students to learn in. One of the things we do at the Office of School Safety is we have a tip line where folks can contact us with any concerns they have about school safety issues. And one thing that our experts really emphasize is that having a healthy school climate is very important, not only to helping kids learn and succeed, but also into preventing acts of violence from happening. So schools can put in place rules and expectations for students, again, not based on the content of what students are saying, but based on ensuring that schools are operating appropriately. And so I echo the mayor's point that making sure that you're aware of what your obligations are under the Constitution, but also what options you may have for action if there is disruptive speech or conduct, I think is really important and incumbent on elected officials.
And kind of speaking to the schools, from a K through 12 level to maybe a college level, how does that differ in terms of that speech, and what's the responsibility of the school then to be able to address it, and how publicly should they address it? We've talked about how if that's not something we value, that speech, is that something that maybe the school administration, whether again K through 12 or university level, should they be announcing that, or do they just let that free flow, especially maybe in the college setting? What's the responsibility there?
Yeah, certainly lots of people have different philosophies on how to draw the balance. What I can say is that generally speaking, in the K through 12 context, the ability that schools have to step in under the First Amendment, they just have more latitude. The idea is that these are juveniles, and ensuring that they're able to learn and that their classroom day is shaped by the way that instructors want it to be shaped is an important part of the process. The university context is very different. I mean, our universities have been hubs of speech in a lot of contexts. Often there will be all sorts of advocacy that not only happens but really starts on college campuses. We view college students more, we don't just view them, they are adults, and they're treated that way. So it depends, again, on the details. But again, ensuring that dialogue is happening in a way that allows kids to go about the basic business of learning, and promoting safe environments, those are all things that I certainly encourage.
And when it comes to public meetings, I know that public employees get a different kind of protection than say board members when it comes to speech. Employees of a public have the right to have a harassment-free workplace, but that's different when it's in the context of a public meeting. And there have been municipalities that have taken particular rules in place and put them in, maybe limiting public comment, putting those terms that if speech or public comment becomes something where it is threatening, harassing, things like that. Again, not speaking about the content of the speech, but what ends up being something where it's a behavior. Can someone talk about the dynamics of, again, the public employees and their protections versus just the public or the board members that might be on there, as well as then the rule setting and the dangers then for limiting free speech? Certainly anyone could say anything, but we also want good conversations too.
Well, I guess I'm going to start from the probably elected body part side of this, because, again, I mentioned the rules, Robert's rules, our council rules. All of the public comment must be directed to the chair. So if you see somebody targeting a board member, even if they said something wild, that is against our rules, right? They must be directed to me if I'm the chair. So I try to redirect in that way. Now, as a mayor of a city with employees, hundreds of them, I do care that people don't feel like they're being targeted. And that's where we talk to our city attorneys and we make sure that people feel safe if there is something wrong reporting to their manager, to our HR department, to whoever it is that they feel safe reporting to. It's critical, because Community for All isn't just for our city, it's for everybody that lives and works here and interacts with us every day.
Yeah, and I would add there's a balance that happens, right? So if you are somebody who works for the city government, but you're performing a similar job to what somebody would be performing in the private sector, it just so happens that your employer is the government. That's a very different context than if you're somebody who's running for office and you're addressing discretionary policy issues. We sort of have an expectation that if you're a mayor or running for other office, you're going to get a lot of engagement on dialogue, and we don't want to stifle that because that's an important part of our democratic process. If you're going about putting in place the directives, though, of the mayor, and you're not the policymaker, the idea that you're then putting yourself on the line to be targeted and criticized in the way that you might with a public official is where concerns can arise. And so, one example we've seen this with recently quite a bit is with election officials. They perform a vital duty to our democracy, and some of them are very prominent public figures. We're involved in litigation right now involving the administrator of the Wisconsin Election Commission, Megan Wolf. She's appointed, but she's in a very significant policy role and a public role. But what she's doing is probably different from what somebody who is an election official who is helping check people in when they're showing up to vote is doing. And so, we see some differences in the law. If you're a public figure, that changes how a defamation case might work, for example. But ultimately, there's a big difference between comments that are directed at policy issues and harassment. If somebody is repeatedly calling somebody and hanging up or emailing them over and over relentlessly, not to advocate for a policy view, but to try to intimidate somebody or to try to make them feel unsettled, that's when the legal analysis can change based on the facts that are going on. But again, none of these things are simple, and the details matter in each of these cases.
And I'm going to have one more question for, again, whoever can answer, and then we'll turn it over to public questions. We live in an age where the internet is everywhere, and we have social media and things like that. I know, Trent, you had mentioned some of that in your data. So talk to me about what people can do. How do you navigate some of that, especially when there's a nameless, faceless person, maybe inciting it?
Yeah, for sure. So I think to the point regarding, I'll mention with social media, the First Amendment, things like that, I mean, that's something that as a society we're still kind of talking about, right? The First Amendment, as the Attorney General pointed out, its government cannot restrict your access to free speech, right? So one of the things that ADL does, we have been doing it for a number of years now, we have gone to leaders of various social media companies to say, please regulate what's going on your social media websites. And we've mentioned this over and over and over again, right? And we saw with Kanye West that I pointed out a few minutes ago to what happened at the Capitol Hill, January 6, 2021. These things were not done in closed doors, right? This was out in the open, right? And I think that was kind of, a wake-up call for certain people on social media to realize, wow, we forget. You hear the numbers, but then you realize, my goodness, like there are literally hundreds of millions of people on our websites, and it's out there in the open. And so one of the things that we encourage folks is most social media companies do have a place where you can report if something hateful has happened you see something hateful on your social media feed, or you were attacked or something along those lines. If it reaches something of like harassment or threat, obviously, right, contacting the police as well too, right? So there are ways to reach out to social media companies, organizations like ADL. We're also trying to reach out to social media companies to recognize that this is the new age that we live in, right? I think it's also interesting to look at how quickly social media has impacted our lives. 20 years ago, Mark Zuckerberg was a sophomore at Harvard University. It was called the Facebook. Right? So now we've moved past that, and it's not just Facebook or MySpace. You have a number of social media outlets, and a lot of people from all around the world are on it, right? So we know social media is here to stay, right? And there are definitely benefits to it. The question is then, how do we make sure it does not get out of hand to the point where people are, and it's happened numerous times, where people are gathering together on social media, they put content out there, and then they're going to start acting on their hatred.
I would say that on the one hand, social media is also really great for getting the message out. I follow all kinds of content creators now who focus specifically on things like dog whistles and are sharing information that I had no idea, but now I can pick up on when people are usually targeting it at me. But I will also say that before social media, my uncle, who shares my last name, and he would get phone calls in the middle of the night, and it would be a recording of a Hitler speech. Or my dad got thousands and thousands of anti-Semitic mail, delivered to my house too. So it happened before social media. It's going to continue. I think that what I want to do in my corner of social media is to be a light, be an educator, and make sure that I'm sharing information that's helpful to our community and creates more belonging. Wow, I'm emotional.
All right, and we can open it up to public questions if anyone has some. All right.
Hi, thank you. Good program, Emily. Question, I think, for Andrew. Attorney General Kaul mentioned, I think, kind of paraphrasing, best defense is going to be a good offense coming together. The mayor mentioned attending the synagogue, so it seems to be an anti-religious component here. And one of the ways people have come together over the years, for centuries, is through regular attendance at church and synagogues. And since the pandemic especially, church attendance is down, or people reporting at least regular attendance. So Andrew, do you see any correlation to that? And do you see any support from the other congregations, which there are many besides yourself out there, coming together to support you and support the effort.
Well, I think you're correct that since the pandemic, that probably accelerated the trend of reduction in attendance at religious events or regular religious service attendance. I think that was already happening, and like many things, the pandemic accelerated that. I will say that Mount Sinai is involved with other congregations sometimes through social action organizations such as Naomi, but also with other events. There was a Marathon County Sheriff's had an event recently that they talked about security in your religious institution, your building space, and that a couple of our representatives went to that, and there's many other congregations there, and I think in general, yes, we do receive support from other religions and other congregations of various denominations throughout the area, and we find that as always very encouraging, and we're there to support them as well. If the need ever arises. So I hope that got it. Okay. Thanks.
I just want to also give a shout out because I do see some current and retired religious folks here, and Naomi, they are attending. They're here. If you want to talk to them, I can point them out to you.
I'll just piggyback off of what was just said by Andrew, sort of an appendage comment. There is this national organization that came up, not in necessarily recent years, but it's been around for a handful of years now, called Faith in Blue. And it partners law enforcement organizations with houses of worship to strengthen those relationships for that very reason, to just make sure that either there's maybe some security measures that could be communicated. It allows police officers and other law enforcement to get a greater sense of what those concerns are, to just open that dialogue. So while we haven't really participated in the past, we're looking to dip our toe into some of those activities this year. So Faith in Blue Weekend is coming up on October 7th through the 10th, I believe, and I'm excited just to see us embrace that concept a little bit further as the years go by.
Captain Baeten, I'm wondering, is there any ordinance or anything in Wausau that would allow for a limitation of the use of a bullhorn in public spaces outside of permitted events? And if there is not, this question is for anyone as to, does anyone know of other communities that have an ordinance or some sort of laws in place about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've asked that very question, and we've searched and tried to find something that would give us some concrete direction. And in seeking counsel from the city attorney's office, we learned that, there's really not necessarily a bright line prohibition on that. It's sort of what we've heard before is, well, it depends. So let's say, for example, we can throw out, we talked a little bit about our summer concert series. We have some great outdoor events that are held in a public space where people gather together to hear a scheduled event that involves, in the series case at least, concerts, music. And so at what point does an individual's enjoyment of that concert, which is being amplified, and that's what I'm here to hear, being drowned out by some other form of amplification like you're indicating? And it again, it kind of goes back to this moving target kind of a thing. And I'm hopeful that as we continue to try to refine our response to that, because I'll tell you, like we've come away from some of these conversations been like, well, I guess that's what we're going to have to go with this time. And then after an event, we're like, well, maybe there was something different we could do, and we need to explore this and research and talk more about that. So it's not a great answer, it's not a great response, but it's kind of one of those things that I just don't think is going to go away, this issue of hate speech. I'll probably fudge the quote a little bit, and it's been attributed to a lot of different people, but the quote is something along the lines of, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, right? Thomas Jefferson to Frederick Douglass to many others have been attributed as saying that. And I think this is one of those issues. It's going to require eternal vigilance. We're going to have to always, sadly, always be working on this. I don't think we're going to get to a day where we're just going to close the book on hate speech and put it on the shelf and say, well, we're done with that one. What's the next challenge for us? I think it's akin to trying to run up a down escalator. Like, you can probably do it if you're hustling, but the moment you take a break, it's bringing you right back down to the bottom. And I think sometimes maybe we've felt like that. I'm confident some of you have felt like that. Like, why isn't this being talked about? And now we're back at the bottom again, and it feels like we're starting over. So we definitely want to be in that conversation and in that struggle to that top of that escalator.
I also want to throw out there that we have an ordinance in the city of Wausau that says you can't, use amplified, like a bullhorn type deal out your car window. So it makes me think that there's probably opportunity for us to update that ordinance as a community and talk about why that's important. So that's something that I'm personally interested in pushing for. And I do know that, yes, that other, we have a fully staffed attorney's office now. So I think it's some of those things that we'll be able to have upcoming conversations on.
Thank you very much. My question is for Attorney General Kaul. And I guess, how do you handle when you have conflicting constitutional rights? For example, the constitutional right to free speech, where it falls into conflict with, say, the Wisconsin state constitution, the inherent right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Article 1, stated right there. And a lot of times the situations that my perception of them is that the actor, who may or may not be hate speech, certainly disruptive, is negatively impacting any number of people around them. And the more obnoxious it is, the greater number that is being impacted. And their constitutional right, under the Wisconsin Constitution, is being impacted, being violated. How do you balance that? And does it still fall down to, are they violating the law? Or is the violation of the Wisconsin constitutional right enough basis to kind of quell it to a certain degree?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. So when the First Amendment has been applied, the context in which things are coming up matters, and courts do sort of put in place a balance. And you can see that in a lot of different contexts. But generally speaking, what courts are looking to is, first, there's an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution trumps other laws and state constitutions. But that doesn't mean that it is without limits. And so again, what courts have done is they've looked to really compelling circumstances where there might be a need to limit speech. Courts have give a very wide latitude to speech. And there are good reasons for that, of course, which is, and we talked about this a bit before, but once the government can get in the business of telling you that this particular type of content of speech is problematic, it becomes much more difficult to draw a line. And so the limitations have been, limitations on speech have to be very, very narrowly drawn. That's the way the balance has come out. But I just as an example, this comes up sometimes in the campaign finance context. Where can we put in place rules that limit the speech of campaign communications, or where does that create infringements on people's rights? There are old Supreme Court cases about things like people. I don't know if it was driving in a van, but blaring their campaign messages. They're driving down the street. I don't know if it involved a bullhorn or what the communication method was, but if you're waking people up at 3 a.m. doing that you might get a different response than if you're doing it in the middle of the day. Likewise, we don't want action by the governments that's targeted at particular speech. There's a Supreme Court case where a municipality targeted a practice that was used by a specific religion. And they said, well, this rule applies to everybody, but it was only relevant in the context of this one practice, and so the courts stepped in. So there is wide latitude, but municipalities are able to put restrictions on the time that speech can happen, or the manner, or the place, and so some forums might be open to the public and open to speech. Others, a room that's set aside for a meeting is not a room where somebody is going to have a right to have lots of speech. So there is balancing, and you're right that the harms that are caused by the speech are relevant and are taken into account, but the way the courts have drawn the balance is very protective of speech because of this fundamental notion that we don't want the government deciding what speech is okay content-wise and what isn't.
Sorry. Can you hear me? Okay. This is for the Wausau Police. In general, as far as protection for these demonstrations, I know sometimes my friends have gone right to the police and said, we're having a demonstration wherever at this time and this date, and you have a person on hand to watch over them. But on other hands, I see there's sometimes when, this is going to hate now, growing up as a kid, waiting at the bus stop for the bus to come, and being identified as somebody that's diverse, I would look forward to being beaten every morning, either outside the school or outside the Catholic Center or outside at the bus stop, and that went on for many years. I know that with financial constraints with the budget, have you looked into anything at all as far as putting cameras out at these bus stops to watch over these children until they get in the bus after mom and pop drop them off?
We actually do have a pretty good infrastructure of cameras around the city and in a lot of our public areas. I'm not confident that we have them at every bus stop, and I'm not sure specifically which ones you're talking about, but I will say that those number of cameras are growing. It allows us to have those extra eyes, and in some cases ears, in a lot of these places that it can be difficult for officers to be. So we have 79 sworn staff at the police department, 79 officers that have arrest authority that have taken an oath. Of those, only 40 are patrol officers, so that are out on the road handling service calls. We get about 40,000 calls for service a year. So at any given time, we have one shift of officers on, right? That could be anywhere from 6 to maybe 9 or 10 officers that are out in the community, a city of 40,000 people responding to all those calls. Now, I give you that background not as an excuse, but just to kind of explain a little bit of the scope of the workload that those officers have. So those technologies that you're speaking of there, like those are welcome technologies for us, and we really do appreciate when we have those opportunities to expand that. As far as other protests that you're talking about, you're absolutely right. So I've been with the department for about 21, 22 years now, and I've worked my share of those situations where there have been maybe some larger protests, and we've had organizers reach out to the police department ahead of time proactively, and we've really appreciated that because it allows us to maybe help with traffic control, maybe if they communicate what their route is going to be, if they're anticipating walking around a specific area, it allows us to plan appropriately for that and to maybe bring in some extra resources if needed in order to create a space for those individuals to express themselves about whatever their issue might be.
I just have a comment about, kind of an overall comment that anyone could answer here. And that it's a different angle, but why the increase in these incidents, in this hate? I know part of it is the social media, such as Facebook, but I believe Facebook has a filter on it. I know we have national leaders who put out all this anti-Semitism. In fact, one of the, well, you know what we're talking about, said just a couple of days ago a very derogatory statement about Jewish people. Just came out. I read it this morning. And then the 400% increase in Wisconsin. What the heck is going on?
Yeah. Sir, I didn't catch your name.
My name is Fred.
Fred,
Yeah.
you just asked the $1 million question. Ask me, at ADL, there are folks who have master's degrees and PhDs who are tracking hate groups literally every day who ask that same question. And they're like, what is going on? I can't speak specifically for Wisconsin. I'd leave that to Allison, JCRC. What I can say what's going on right now is I think it's a combination of a few things taking place. Right? So I think number one, I do a lot of presentations across the Midwest. And I tell folks, regardless of your racial background, religious background, socioeconomic background, do you root for the Packers or the Bears, the Vikings, wherever it is? Yeah, we are in Wisconsin. Yes, of course, yes. Regardless of whatever your background is, it's been a rough go for America for the last several years. Every one of us has been impacted in some way, politically, socially, medically, right? And so when you look at just kind of using a couple of examples, regardless of wherever you are on the political spectrum, our last two presidential elections have been incredibly heated, controversial, right? People on both sides of the political spectrum have been upset with the results, right, one way or the other. Probably going to experience something similar like that again in the next presidential election. We might be entering uncharted territory in terms of, we'll see how things impact there. From a social standpoint, I think about, it was a little over 3 years ago, but the horrendous murder of George Floyd brought into impact the fact that racial issues that have existed for years in this country still have gone unresolved, right? And there were a lot of people who, most protests were peaceful across the United States. There were a couple of instances where riots broke out, but it spoke to the idea that there are still issues that have existed in this country for a long time we didn't address. And then, of course, the elephant in the room, right? Probably the one thing that's going to define this decade, right, when we get to the end of the decade, is COVID. It was a pandemic, and it's weird, we're still kind of seeing the after effects of it. I'm sure they're going to be writing history books about it in another generation, but we haven't experienced something like that in this country in a century. There are very few people alive today who were there in 1918, 1919 when we saw the last real major kind of pandemic. And so I mentioned all these things. When you mix all that in a pot together, right, and all these things that are kind of going on, I think there are a lot of Americans who are scared and who are angry and who are frustrated. And I'm not and I say this a lot, like I'm not a psychologist. I don't know if there are any in the room or anybody watching at home, right? But there's something within us as human nature that when it feels like our lives are falling apart or our worlds are falling apart, we have to blame someone. We have to find a scapegoat, right? It has to be somebody's fault that my factory closed down, I lost my job. It has to be somebody's fault that my kids are learning these things in school that I don't want them to learn. It's got to be somebody's fault that my political candidate didn't win. It's got to be somebody's fault that I'm stuck at home under quarantine because this COVID thing came out of nowhere, right? And there's just something that people kind of reach to, and oftentimes one of the phrases we use at ADL is the phrase canary in a coal mine, meaning that usually one of, if not one of the first groups that gets targeted when times turn sour are Jews. And not too far behind Jews, if Jews are not the first group, are people of color, are the poor, are immigrants, are people of various sexual orientations. It's the people that are viewed as the other that are causing this trouble and are causing these problems. And it's not just what we've seen in the last few years in the United States. We've seen this repeat over and over again, actually throughout human history. So why is that? I know it's a very long-winded answer. There's a lot going on. I think in this country there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of raw emotion happening right now in the United States, and people are trying to find answers. And I think that's when people get susceptible to conspiracy theories or seeing things online, and they're like, well, that makes sense. That confirms what I was probably thinking deep down anyway. I'm going to take that idea and I'm going to run with it. And there are people then who say they don't just think it, or they may not say something at the dinner table. They're going to go act out because they feel like they have to.
So Trent stole most of the exact same things I was going to say, which makes sense because we work in the same circles. But But basically, yeah, it does boil down to, and it's been proven throughout history, times of social, political, economic uncertainty, people are scared. People are looking for easy answers. And anti-Semitism, as well as in America, especially racism, have been deeply ingrained into society, Western society specifically, for a long time, as well as xenophobia. And so those are mentalities that there are people who would never join a hate group, would never call themselves, an anti-Semite or a hate person, but they've had these deep-seated mentalities. Maybe they will make comments about the Rothschilds and Jews owning the banks without really thinking about it, because they've heard it over and over. And so with the rise of social media, and as he said, the past two specifically elections, everything's become very polarized. So what you see becomes on social media and in your circles becomes sort of an echo chamber of polarized extremist views that you'll hear over and you'll read over and over. And though you'll never think of yourselves as sharing, the same space as a known anti-Semite, you may start spouting those kinds of things and thus increasing the amount of incidents that we see throughout the world, really, not just the United States. And one of the things specific to Wisconsin is, like I said, we track expression. So yes, seeing vandalism and harassment go up is scary, but we also see people feeling liberated to say things that they used to whisper or things that they never said out loud. And so a lot of the increase we see is in these spreads of conspiracy theories, in these ideas of Jews control the world or Jews are behind any situational issue such as COVID or economic crisis. And so because there has been this polarized view and this acceptance of polarized view, a lot of people in Wisconsin and everywhere else have been sharing and spreading and believing these ideals, and it has boiled into comments made by students on campuses. It's boiled into political discourse during public campaigns or public debates, and it's boiled into spreading of flyers or newsletters that go out to the wider community. So that's, pretty much exactly the same thing as Trent said. Anti-Semitism, hate has never gone away. Oftentimes when I give presentations, people assume that anti-Semitism ended after the Holocaust. It didn't. It never went away, and it never was addressed, and it's always been in the background, and it's been spreading, and now it's just reached a boiling point that it's come into the more public eye. In the Jewish community, we've always kind of seen it, and in groups like ADL and the JCRC where we study it, we'd seen that uptick, but it wasn't until there was the march in Charlottesville that a lot of, more public community recognized that maybe there was something that had been brewing for a long time and was now acceptable for people to say out loud.
Thank you for those answers. I'm really here looking for some way to address these issues actively in the community. In the community, I'm a member of the group, A Community for All, and I'm very proud of that. We have a lot of members here today listening to you, your very valuable information. And what I wanted to say is that Community for All is trying to bring people together in this community, just like other groups are, and I really hope that anybody here today who is maybe not a member of Community for All, but a member of a church, faith group, any other organization that really believes that this stuff is harming our community, let's get together, let's do something, let's counter the negativity with some positivity, and we need to work together. It seems like we have a lot of people here that want to do some real good, but we're only going to do it, like Josh said, we're only going to do it if we all come together. We got to be louder than the hate, right? But that takes a lot of people, and CFA has a few very outspoken people, but we need a lot more people from all the groups here working together. And I also know that Luke is trying to create some conversations in this community by having people come together. So if you're here today and you're from a different group or you're just not sure what you can do, reach out to me, reach out to anybody in our group, to Katie. We need to come together because that's the only way we're going to at least counter this with a positive message. I know we can't fix it overnight. I had one question. So for private versus public meetings, so like, let's say concert on the square, is that private or public? And can you then enforce kicking Mr. You-know-who off the 400 block because it's a private event? Or the art festival last week, can you kick him off? I know he just goes across the street, but like, when can you say, dude, you got to get out of here?
I think we're going to tag team this one.
Thank you.
But first, I'm going to start off with we're doing some research on the 400 block specifically, and it's an interesting case because it's considered something other than a park. It's a public forum. The private community donated, the public donated, taxpayers donated, and so it's kind of under different rules. And that's some of our situation here, is that it's a little bit different. But it being a public forum has created an opportunity for people to come in and do that kind of stuff disruptively. I don't know, Captain Baeten.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. It's been explained to us and outlined that this is a place of public discourse. And then when we're talking about like the Festival of Arts, for example, I mean, in that case, we're right on the city street and we're going right down several blocks of, a public thoroughfare, and it makes it really, really difficult to address specific things on there. Now we're in a setting right now and in this venue, and it's open to anybody that would want to come in and participate and ask whatever question they have on their mind, whether we want to hear that question or not. But I think it would probably be pretty different if this were a very private, ticketed event, and it's very limited on who's allowed to come in here, and we've controlled that much more tightly. Whereas, when we go back to the 400 block, where there's really no control to that, really anybody is welcome to come on down and be in that area and primarily enjoy the concert. Like that's what we would want to see. But we've seen that people are using sort of this gathering as, well, somebody did all this work for me and brought all these people together, I'm going to take advantage of it. And then that's where we're kind of get put in this pickle.
However, the other parks that are designated as parks, when you rent them, they're yours. You can kick people out. So it's kind of an interesting scenario we have.
I have a question, but first of all, we have to address the elephant in the room, and I mean elephant in the room. We have to be honest before we can make any progress. First of all, the first group that is targeted are the LGBTQ. They are always under the gun. And we start to sit up and take notice as a whole when it comes to the next group, which is the Jewish population. The other thing, it wasn't COVID that caused this. We have two political parties that make up our country pretty much. One is way over here on the extreme fringes of the spectrum. The other one kind of hovers around the middle, goes a little bit to the left, but we can't say both sides, because it is not both sides. We have this group over here who wants to make it a crime to be LGBTQ. They want it to be a crime to teach history in our schools, true history. This group doesn't want to do that. They want the truth. They want facts. We have people over here that constantly repeat falsehoods. Let's go back to COVID. I was attacked about COVID because I was on the school board, and I wanted to keep our staff and our teachers and their families safe and require masks. Wow. Hate radio in this city. We have a hate radio person that belongs to the Mothers of Liberty or whatever it's called, the other hate group that has taken off. It's the second female hate group in this country after the Daughters of Civil War. We have to be honest. If we want to make any progress, we have to be honest about what is causing this. We need these people to either go back under their rocks or be enlightened. But we can't pretend that we don't know what's going on. But the question I had was about law enforcement is, When does it go from free speech to disorderly conduct? If I'm sitting out at an outdoor dining area for a restaurant, and I'm having a conversation with my friends, and somebody comes behind me, I don't care what they're doing. I mean, let's say we're Christmas time, and in Italy they have these outdoor arenas that are all plasticed up and warm. So you could really have a Christmas caroler. They could come and sing one song, and we have to stop our conversation for them to do that. That's fine. But if they stand there the whole time and sing, that gets to be disruptive. And it's the same thing with somebody that wants to come and what other people would recognize as hate speech. Once the volume gets to a certain point and they are quelling what everybody is doing around them, that's disruption to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question. I think it's a really difficult question because I think it goes back to what we've heard a couple of times already this morning, which is it depends. It depends on the specifics of that incident. And that's why I would really encourage anybody to call us for each of those incidents, because I think it might be sort of easy for us to get into this mindset of like, oh, this is another one of these calls. I can tell you, I've been doing this a couple decades, and I'm sure I've been in that mode where you get lulled into this complacency where you're like, oh, it's another one of these kinds of calls. I know how those go. And the reality is no, I don't, because I haven't been to that specific call. And there's details and nuance that make each of those calls unique. It might be distance from where this person is standing to where these other people are trying to converse or enjoy a meal or whatever. It might be the time of day. It might be the loudness of what is going on. Have we tried intervening with that individual already? That's all really important information for those responding officers when they come. So then they can consult with each other. They can try going over and speaking with that individual and saying, hey, let's first maybe try to mediate the problem here, or let's encourage you to, maybe go somewhere else or take into consideration these other folks. If we're not able to do that, now I'm going to weigh in all these other factors as well and see, is there anything actionable that I'm able to do in this situation? And I will say, it might not feel like it right now because we're having this forum. We're pretty successful doing that. We're pretty successful in arriving and resolving concerns. We have great patrol officers that are really dedicated. We have people that come from a variety of backgrounds as well. We actively recruit people that maybe hadn't thought about being a police officer. Maybe they have an MBA. We do have a couple of individuals with law degrees. We have a pharmacist who practiced pharmacy for 14, 15 years and decided, I want to be a police officer now. All of these individuals have different approaches on how to solve a problem. And I think that makes us much more effective. Again, as evidenced by us having this panel, it might not always feel that way, but I'm really, really confident in the abilities of our officers, and I'm really, really confident in the goodness of our community in working with those officers to work on this problem.
And I'd like to add something too. I'm sometimes asked what my favorite part of my job is, and the answer is actually easy, which is that I love going around the state talking to folks about what they're doing, what issues they're confronted with, what the challenges they're seeing, what their proposed solutions are. And there are a lot of reasons I like that. But fundamentally, when you are out talking to folks across the state of Wisconsin, you find people who care about their families, they care about their neighbors, they want their communities to succeed, they want their kids to go to good schools, they want to be safe in their communities. And the point I want to make is that actually engaging with people gives you a very different sense of things than listening to talk radio or watching cable news or reading Facebook. Outrage sells. I think it's 9 times more engagement for posts that lead to outrage versus posts that lead to non-outraged responses. And so the algorithms that these social media companies used boost those outrageous comments to the top. Right now we're seeing with Twitter, the owner of Twitter, attacking the ADL and platforming hate speech and other really concerning communications. But actually engaging with people in real life, I think, leads to a very different a sense of things going on. One of the things that's really remarkable is that just as people can become radicalized, they can also become de-radicalized. There are people who have been part of hate groups who have left and who speak against it. Now, I'm not suggesting that every time you see somebody engaging in speech you find repugnant that you should go and have a debate with them, but having engagement, having dialogue, and responding, just like a public forum allows somebody to say something hateful, it also allows 10 people here to go to that same forum and hold signs that say something positive and inclusive. Again, that is not easy. It's not always fast, but I do think it's critically important in addressing some of those things, because as people end up behind screens or isolated and have less engagement, I think you do see more extremism, and one of the counters to that is by engaging with folks.
Thank you for coming here, and I can't agree with you more than what you just said. I host a book group every summer, and we did See No Stranger, and the first chapter was entitled Wonder, and she talked about having people who don't know each other or think differently begin to wonder about each other, and so that's my theme word. Anyhow, I don't know who brought up language, but we're going to have another election coming up. Although some of my neighbors never quit with the election, they have their Trump 2024 sign, and excuse me if you hate this language, it says, at the bottom of the big flag and the big sign says, "Fuck your feelings." These are put in the yards in my neighborhood that I have to look at each and every day. I'm wondering if there are any kind of laws about putting those types of things out there. I did talk 2 years ago with someone. I stopped. She had the great big thing in her doorway so that she didn't have to count on the wind to blow it so you could see the F word. And I just happened to stop and I said, "Is that really necessary?" "Well, that's my husband's First Amendment right." I said, "But we have people walking through here. We have children walking through here." "Oh, they hear that every day in school." Is that how we're becoming? That we can just put anything on a sign? I really wanted to say, let's just pretend her husband is Bobby Schmidt. I wanted to say to her, so in other words, if I wanted to put F Bobby Schmidt on my lawn, that would be okay? Of course, I didn't say that. I was respectful. She did have the police come to my house.
So I actually do have a little bit of info on this. My office got a huge influx of questions like this during the 2020 election, so many that I had the city attorney's office publish a white paper because people were really upset by exactly what you're saying, these offensive, intentionally offensive signs, flags, all of it, bumper stickers. And the short answer is it is constitutionally protected, but I don't think it means you need to respond in kind. I know that when I had a neighbor that set something up that I didn't love, on Amazon they have these signs that just say, "Love your neighbor." And I got one and I stuck it in my yard and that was that. And actually a bunch of people wanted that sign, so I got a bunch more and our neighborhood is filled with them. So I recognize that it's hard, and obviously if you have kids, like, you don't love that for them. But I think it also opens up an opportunity to have a discussion about what kind of person and values you want to show the community and what you can create more of versus that.
So I would say I have a little bit of experience in being around angry people. And being in a contentious environment at times. And I think maybe I just get comfortable being there a little bit, kind of like what Allison said before. You're surrounded by a lot of this, and you just kind of get used to operating there. But there was a really good quote that I read recently. It's a Russell M. Nelson quote where he said, "Anger never persuades, hostility builds no one, and contention never leads to inspired solutions." And so I think we can hear that and be like, that's a great message for some people I know. But I think it's a great message for us too. And when we're considering how we want to respond to that kind of hate speech or rhetoric that's out there in the world, if we're concerned that our silence is somehow indicative of us approving of that, or we want to be a voice for an individual or a group being targeted, we can be a voice by supporting them and being kind. Our voice doesn't have to mimic the voice of those that are spewing these hateful things. We can be supportive in a lot of really positive ways, like the mayor was just saying here.
Before I ask my question, I'd just like to very quickly comment in regards to some things that some other people said earlier. I was closely monitoring the individual for a while online who is our local anti-Semitic activist, if you will. And he actually did, I saw a post in which he told his personal story of how he became on the path that he is on, and he did actually state that it was specifically observations and suspicions that he had during COVID that led him to becoming anti-Semitic. He had no problems with Jews prior to COVID. But anyway, I'm concerned about people being influenced and people being susceptible to these messages. And what I'd like to know is what methods we, either as Jews or as allies of the Jewish people or what have you, what we can do to, how we can exercise our right to speak to prevent these toxic messages and misinformation and lies from spreading.
So there's a lot of different ways, and the biggest thing comes down to education, knowing what it is, because if you don't even know what the rhetoric is that's being shared, it's harder even to talk to people about it and having conversations about it. So some of the ways we've done that is Trent has gone to communities, I've gone to communities to give presentations where we talk about, you know, current trends, and we show examples of things that people are seeing or people are saying. And then, you know, give resources to follow up with reading it. The ADL has a lot of good stuff. The Southern Poverty Law Center puts out a lot of good resources. And being proactive with like a community group, like you were talking about that you put together, that's a wonderful way of doing it. So as a community group, bringing all these different people together and maybe taking a time that each month you do a gathering focused on different communities, and you bring in people from that community to talk about what it's like to be, you know, Jewish, for example, in Wisconsin, what their Jewish story is, what it's like to, you know, live out Jewishly in the modern day. And then the next one, you bring in someone from the LGBTQ plus community to talk about their story, to talk about their history, and to have those conversations. And you do those over time. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon to kind of combat all of these. And really through education and understanding what's being spread, it might be hard to read some of this to know what it is, but you're not going to recognize it or be able to counter it unless you can be the person that responds, be the person that knows what the history behind that statement was. I was telling Andy that I often ask people to give me their honest questions, knowing that they most likely don't have ill intents, but it may come out of ignorance or long-held stereotypes that they weren't aware of. And I have had people say things to me that would seem offensive, but I come at it from instead an education moment, because I want to have those conversations. I want to provide spaces where people can express something that they may think and then be able to counter it with history or with information on where that came from and how that's harmful to a community. and then talk about why it is that they've believed that. So as an ally or as a member of the communities, finding others that want to build a stronger community, finding others that have already created a group and bringing more to the table to have those conversations, to educate each other and to get to know each other is really the best way to stand up to this kind of hateful rhetoric and to say, no, we won't continue to let this spread. We want to sit and have honest conversations that may make us feel uncomfortable. And that's okay. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It means you're having an honest moment and that you're having possibly even healthy arguments or misunderstandings that you're talking through. Because if you only meet with people that have the same exact beliefs and stories as you, you're going to be in an echo chamber and you're not going to help the wider community. So taking these moments to step out and together say, can we talk? Can we bring together each other and listen? Are the best ways to combat that.
And I think with that, that is all the time that we have. I'm glad that we had about 45 minutes for questions, and it was great questions. Thank you so much for everyone attending. I also butchered Whips's name, even though I've known and worked with him for about 10 years. So the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, thank you so much for hosting us. Again, thank you all for attending here, asking your questions, listening online, maybe watching this later. And thank you for joining us for this very important discussion.